Okay, good morning. We'll start. So last week we started looking at this two-dimensional XY model, and more precisely we wanted to prove an upper bound on the two-point function. So we are looking at the absolute value of the expected value of S0 scalar product Sk in a box lambda. So lambda was just our usual box of radius n, and with arbitrary boundary condition eta, and we wanted to upper bound that. And we arrived at the following stage where we were able to show that this is always smaller than exponential of minus what we call d of r, where okay, maybe let me first say what R is. So R is a function from ZD to R such that Rj is equal to 0 for all j not in the box. And then this function dr was defined as Rk minus R naught minus beta prime and the Dirichlet energy of R. So beta prime was just 1 plus epsilon beta, and for some fixed epsilon that won't matter. And this epsilon, let me maybe recall it. So this was defined as 1/2 sum over all edges ij intersecting the box, gradient R ij squared. Okay. So that was the setting, and then at this stage, of course, what we want to do, since we want to have an upper bound which is as small as possible, we want to maximize this function d among all the functions R which satisfy this boundary condition. Okay. So I stated the lemma. Let me briefly write it down again so that we have the statement on the board. So it was lemma 913, which I stated last time. So we assume that the point K here is in the box, but is different from 0. Okay. Then the statement is that this functional D here possesses a unique maximizer. Unique maximizer, which I will call R star, among function R vanishing outside the box. Okay. And moreover, one has some explicit expression or information about this maximizer R star. On one hand, it's a solution to the following equation. So we have that Laplacian of R star at I, it's equal to the indicator that I is equal to 0 minus the indicator that I is equal to k, where k and 0 are, of course, these 2 points here, divided by beta prime. That's for any I in the box lambda. And then, so that's a solution, that's an equation that the maximizer satisfies. It's actually the only solution to this equation with the given boundary conditions. And it has also an explicit expression. The solution, it's R star I. It's given by, let me get the signs correctly. So it's G lambda ik minus G lambda I0 divided by 4 beta prime. Okay. Where G lambda ik is the green function of the simple random walk, so it's the expected number of visits to vertex k starting from vertex I before exiting the box lambda. Okay. So that's the statement, and I'm going for the moment to assume the validity of this statement and show how this allows us to get the bounds we wanted on this power law decay that we wanted for this two-point function, and then I will prove lemma 913. Okay. So assuming this lemma, assuming for the moment this lemma, we get, so I start from here, so let me compute this d of r. I want to do it in a proper way. Oh yes, there was a comment. I remember that I wanted to say something. So if you remember, I have not said it here, but when deriving this bound here in terms of this functional d, we made an assumption that the function r that we were going to work with in the end, the solution, which is this r star here, satisfied some particular property. So maybe I write it here, or okay, I can do it here. So we wanted, so first observation, so we wanted this condition that I called S last time, which was that, do I have it somewhere written? Which was, okay, something like the fact that we wanted Ri minus Rj to be smaller than a constant C over beta for all ij intersecting the box, all the edges intersecting the box lambda. Okay, that was the condition we wanted. So first thing, we should check that it's indeed satisfied for this. But that's the case, again, by random walk estimates. So random walk estimates allows you to see what is the effect of the initial point, say, in this green function. So if I'm interested in the expected number of visits at the vertex k before exiting the box lambda, what is the effect of starting from I or from one of the nearest neighbor of I? Okay, it should not matter very much. Indeed, does not matter very much. So what you can prove is the following. There exists a constant C such that the green function in lambda, say vi, minus the green function in lambda. Well, okay, I prefer to play with. Let me do this way. It's symmetric, of course, but it's probably better if I write it this way. Okay, like that. This quantity is smaller than, say, 2c, uniformly in everything. So it will be uniformly in n, in ij, in E lambda, and in V in the box. Okay. So if you start from two neighboring, if you take I and j to neighboring vertices of the box, and you start from either I or j, then the expected number of time you will visit the vertex V is comparable. It will differ by at most an absolute constant. Okay. So from this and the fact that the solution R that we are looking at is of this form, you immediately deduce the following. So this implies that R star I minus R star j is smaller than C over beta. I put 2 here just to get 1 at this stage. So that indeed this condition S is satisfied for the maximizer that we're interested in. So that was just a comment that this condition is automatically satisfied by the solution to this maximization problem. Okay. So now that we have dealt with that, let's move on to this issue of seeing what upper bound it gives us on the two-point function. So I have to compute d of r star, where r star is given by this quantity. I want d of r star. So by definition, this is r star k minus r star 0 minus beta prime e of r star. Okay. So let's write things down explicitly. So this will be r star k minus r star 0 minus beta prime over 2 sum over all ij in E lambda b gradient r star ij square. Okay, we've just written down explicitly this Dirichlet energy. And then we proceed as we do usually. So at this stage, we just make a summation by parts. So we use these discrete green identities. So this without the minus sign. This is just, say, minus beta prime over 2, sum over all I in lambda, r star I, Laplacian r star I, plus a boundary term, principal. Maybe I will do it on the next line. So plus sum over all I in lambda, j not in lambda, I and j neighbors, r star j, gradient r star ij. Okay, the usual discrete green identities that we already used many times. Now, R star satisfies this boundary condition that it has to be 0 outside the box lambda. Since j is always outside the box lambda, this is equal to 0. And this term is just vanishing. So there are no boundary terms here. So the only thing that remains is this guy. But here also we know more, since we know that the Laplacian of R star at I is given by this expression. Okay, the maximizer satisfied Laplacian of R star is given by this. So I can just substitute. So this is equal to the indicator that I is equal to 0 minus the indicator that I is equal to k divided by beta prime. Okay, so if I do that, if I inject all this inside here, I get the following. So I get R star k minus R star 0. So minus minus will give me plus beta prime over 2. Then when I sum over all i's, the only I that will give me a non-zero contribution are when I is equal to 0 or when I is equal to k. So I will get, when I is equal to 0, I will get R star 0 over beta prime. So R star 0. When I is equal to k, I get minus R star k, so minus R star k over beta prime. And that's what I get when I sum over I. Then the beta prime just go away. And what you're left with is R star k minus R star 0 minus 1/2 of R star k minus R star 0. So you just get 1/2 of R star k minus R star 0. That's where we are now. So up to now, I've only used the fact that Laplacian of R star satisfies this equation. Now I'm going to use explicitly the form of R star, injecting it here, but maybe I will do it on another board to have more room. Okay, so I continue from there. So this is, so R, okay, 1/2. Then R star k minus R star 0, so R star is here, so there is a 1/4 beta prime, which I take out, so it will be, instead of 1/2, I get 8 beta prime here. Then I get all these green functions, so I will get g lambda kk minus g lambda k0. That's for R star k. Then I have to subtract R star 0, so I will get minus g lambda 0k plus g lambda 0, 0. So if you compare this with the expression we got in this heuristic argument that I explained last week, you will see that it's exactly the same quantity. And as I explained last week, this combination of these 4 diverging terms, when lambda increases to Z2, this converges actually to some finite quantity which is given by 4 over pi log of the L2 norm of k. So again, it's just random walk estimate. You estimate, you compute the asymptotic behavior of all these green functions, and what remains is exactly this. And if you combine the two, you get in the end that this converges when lambda grows to Z2 to 1 over 2 pi beta prime log of K2, which was exactly what we wanted to prove. Okay, so this will conclude the proof of this power law decay of two-point function, provided that I'm able to prove this lemma 913. Okay, so that's the only thing left. That's what I'm going to do now. So I will keep the statement on the board, and I will make the proof here. Okay, so proof of lemma 913. Well, it's completely similar to what we did for the Mermin-Wagner theorem. That is, we are going to first characterize critical points of this functional and then solve the equation. So let's say R is a critical point of the functional D, if and only if the derivative with respect to S of D of R plus S delta at S equals 0 is equal to 0 for any perturbation delta that respects the boundary condition imposed on R, that is, delta has to be 0 outside the box, because R has to be 0 outside the box. So for all delta from Z2 to R, such that delta J is equal to 0 for all J not in the box lambda. Okay. This is just characterization, and then what we have to do is to compute explicitly this derivative and see what this gives us. So the derivative with respect to S of, so let me write again exactly what is this guy. So it will be Rk, say minus R0, plus S delta K minus S delta 0. So that's just what I get from the first part of, okay, it's not on the board anymore, from this part, if you want, of the function D. And then I get the second part, which will be beta prime E of R plus S delta, and everything has to be evaluated at S equals 0. Okay. So this part we already computed its derivative at 0 when we were doing the Mermin-Wagner theorem, so we'll get exactly the same thing. And here, these first four terms, when I compute derivative with respect to S, the only thing that survives is delta k minus delta 0. So this is equal to delta k minus delta 0 minus beta prime. And by the computation we did for the Mermin-Wagner theorem, we get sum over all ij in E lambda b, gradient R ij, gradient delta ij. I already did this computation. Okay, so once more, we are going to use, let me take some color. We are going to use this discrete green identity to rewrite that in a more suitable way. So this is just minus the sum over all I in lambda, delta I, Laplacian R I, that's for the main term, and then we get a boundary term, which will be plus sum over all I in lambda, J not in lambda, I and J neighbors. It's always the same. Okay. And then we get delta J, gradient R, Ij. Okay, always the same. And then the observation is that the boundary term actually vanishes because when j is not in, since j is not in lambda and delta j is 0 outside lambda, this delta j is equal to 0. So this whole term vanishes. And we're only left with that. Okay, now it's almost over. So I get delta k that multiplies, so 1 because of this guy here, 1. But I also get a delta k which comes from this sum here when I have I equal k, the delta k. So let me take it out. So delta, it's 1 minus, plus beta prime Laplacian Ri, so Rk. We'll get something like that. That's for the term where delta k appears. So this guy and this guy when I is equal to k. Then I get a similar thing for delta 0. So it will be with a minus. Or let me put it with a plus. With delta 0, then I get, say, minus 1 plus beta prime delta R 0. Exactly the same kind of contribution, and then I get the remainder and the other terms in the sum, so it will be sum over all I in lambda, I different from 0 and k, because I've already taken the two terms 0 and k. I have a beta prime, actually it's a plus, and then I get delta I Laplacian R I. Okay, and that has to vanish. We want this to vanish, so this has to be 0. For any delta with proper boundary condition, so such that delta j equals 0 for all j, not in lambda. Okay. So again, this forces us to choose R in such a way that this guy is equal to 0. This has to be equal to 0. And then this has to be equal to 0. And this has to be equal to 0. Okay. So from all this, we deduce the following. So R is a critical point of D, if and only if we have that Laplacian R at I. So it has to be 0 if I is different from 0 and k. It has to be equal to minus 1 over beta prime if I is equal to k. So this will be minus the indicator that I is equal to k divided by beta prime. And if I is equal to 0, we get that it has to be equal to plus 1 over beta prime. So I get the indicator that I is equal to 0. Okay, so that should match what I claimed here. Okay, so that's the first thing. So the only critical points of the function D are the functions R that satisfy this equation. So now we have to solve this equation in order to get the second statement. So let's solve this equation. So the first observation is the following. So observation, thanks to the boundary condition that R satisfies, so R is 0 outside the box lambda, I can write the following. So if you remember things that we also did in the chapter on the Gaussian free field, so if I look at the Laplacian of R at some vertex I, then this is equal to the Laplacian inside lambda, so the restriction of the Laplacian to the box lambda that we introduced in this other chapter, evaluated at I, plus the sum over all j not in lambda Rj. That was just an identity that we derived in this other chapter. But now outside the box lambda, R is 0. So this correction is actually not there. Okay, so the Laplacian of R, the usual Laplacian, the Laplacian restricted to lambda, it gives you the same result as long as you're only considering functions which vanish outside the box lambda. Okay. But now that's good because this, so it means that in this equation, this Laplacian, I can replace it by the Laplacian inside lambda. And why is it good? It's good because we already know the inverse of this, the Laplacian of inside lambda, its inverse is the green function of the random walk. So we already know that actually one has to put -1/4 Laplacian inside lambda minus 1. The inverse of this matrix is exactly the matrix G lambda. Okay, that's what we proved in this chapter on the GFF. So this we are going to use. So this is true. So in particular, for any I inside the box lambda, I can write Ri. So solution to this equation which is there, I can write Ri as, say, sum over all j in lambda, G lambda ij. Okay, there is the -1/4 Laplacian lambda Rj. Okay, I'm just applying this matrix to this vector, and since G and -1/4 delta lambda are inverse of each other, this just gives me Ri. Okay. Now I'm using the fact that the Laplacian inside lambda of R is the same thing as the Laplacian of R, and we already know that the Laplacian of R satisfies this. Okay. So this, so just the Laplacian part, this guy here is equal to 1, I equals 0 minus 1, I equal to k, divided by beta prime. Okay. So again, out of this whole sum, only two terms survive. It's the term when j is equal to 0 and the term when j is equal to k. Okay, so what we get is, let's take first the term j equal to k, because I want to have a positive term first, so the two minuses, it will be better. So I get 1 over 4 beta prime. This I can put in front, and then I get, when I take I equal to k, I get g lambda kj. No, sorry, it's I is fixed. It's I'm summing over j, so ik minus g lambda I0. Okay, and this should match what is written here. Okay, so indeed we have solved the solution. We have proven this lemma completely. Further question about this proof? It's very similar to what we did. Yes?
Can you explain it again how you get the expression for Ri?
This part? Yes, so I'm using the fact that g lambda and -1/4 Laplacian inside lambda are inverse of each other. So this matrix times this matrix, just the identity. So if I apply the identity on R, I just get R. Okay, so that's the first line. It's really empty. Now I know by what we did before that the Laplacian in lambda of R, which is the same as the Laplacian of R, the full Laplacian of R, satisfies the equation which is there, which is it's equal to the indicator that I equals 0 minus the indicator that I equal to k divided by beta prime. Okay, so I'm just substituting. This is equal to this expression here. Okay, and then once I've made this substitution, the only term in the sum that survive are, sorry, it's j, it's not I. Maybe that was what was confusing you. Okay, I'm evaluating it at j, not at I. So j equals 0, j equals k. So the only terms that survive are these two terms. Otherwise, I just get 0 because the indicators are 0, and then I get this expression. All the other terms in the sum are 0 because the indicator vanish. Okay. Yes?
We said that R is critical point if we have this
Yes.
False, but did we? The lemma also is the maximizer.
Oh, yes, you're right. I should prove that it's a maximizer. Could just be a critical point. Let me prove that it's a maximizer. Okay, it's basically, okay, let's do it. So let's compute d of r star plus delta. Okay, so where delta is as usual, okay, it's vanishing outside the box lambda, then this is equal to, okay, r star k minus r star 0 plus delta k minus delta 0 minus beta prime r star plus delta. Probably I should. Okay, I can conclude here because this statement we don't need anymore. Okay. Put it here. Okay, we are at this stage. Now I have to investigate what exactly is this Dirichlet energy here. So let me just look at this term first, term of this type. So by the very form of this Dirichlet energy, this is just E of r star plus E of delta plus the term that comes when you expand the square, you get a cross term here. So it will be given by the sum over all ij in E lambda b gradient r star ij gradient delta ij. The two disappear with the 1/2 which appears in the definition of the Dirichlet energy. And then you conclude again as before. So this, if I've not made any sign mistakes, which could happen, this should work. So this is minus sum over all I in lambda, delta I, Laplacian R I, plus sum over I in lambda, j not in lambda, I neighboring j, delta j, gradient R ij. And as before, outside lambda j, delta j is 0, so this guy is 0. Okay. And here, the Laplacian R of I is, as we already used many times, the indicator that I is 0 minus the indicator that I is k divided by beta prime. Okay. So I'm just substituting and I get the following. So this part of the functional is just given by E of r star plus E of delta minus, or say plus, but then I change the order here. It will be I, okay, it will be delta k minus delta 0 over beta prime. Okay, hopefully I'm not forgetting anything. Okay, that's what, if I've not made any mistake, that's what we get. And then I have to just inject it here. So this means that d of r star plus delta is equal to r star k minus r star 0 plus delta k minus delta 0. Then I have to subtract, so minus beta prime times this, so we get minus beta prime E of r star. Not very happy with the sign, I think. Or am I? No, probably it's fine. Beta prime E of r star minus beta prime E of delta. We'll see in the end what we get. And then I still get this guy. So the beta prime cancel. So I get minus delta k plus delta 0. Okay. So this is good because this makes all this guy disappear. Then what I'm left with is r star k minus r star 0 minus beta prime epsilon of r star, which is just d of r star, minus beta prime and the Dirichlet energy of delta, but the Dirichlet energy is a quadratic function, it's the sum of square. So again, this is positive quantity. actually strictly positive if delta is not identically 0. And so this is, I'm subtracting something, so this is always smaller than the of R star. So indeed, R star is the maximizer of the functional D. It's bigger than any other value I get. Okay, thanks. Indeed, I should have proved this. Good. Other questions? If not, let me conclude this chapter with a couple of comments on what is known about these models, what is expected about these models. And okay, so some concluding remarks. Okay. So first is that in dimension 1, it's easy to prove that the decay of the two-point function is exponential always. So, so S0 Sk is smaller than E minus C, which depends on beta, of course, times K for all beta. Okay. For any ON model. It's even more general than that. I mean, okay, it's super general that the correlation decay exponentially fast at high temperature. Okay, so that's for D equal 1. So the result is actually much stronger than the bound we got. We just got a power law, right? So the interest of what we did is not dimension 1, it's really dimension 2, where the statement is non-trivial. Dimension 1, it's very easy to prove much stronger statement. Okay. Second thing is our result we only proved this decay in dimension 2. It's because in dimension 3 and higher there is no decay because we, as I mentioned, in this case at low temperature there is positive magnetization. So in dimension greater or equal to 3, we will prove in the next chapter that there is long-range order at low temperatures, so for large beta. So in particular, there is no decay. The two-point function does not decay. Okay, so nothing to prove there, dimension 3 and higher. The most interesting case is, of course, dimension 2. It's the one we have been working on. So let me say about dimension 2, what is known. So now I have to be a bit more specific. This was true for any ON models. This also, the second statement, is true for any ON models. Here I have to distinguish. So for the XY model, Fröhlich and Spencer proved a power law lower bound on the two-point function. Let's say. So in particular, we cannot improve on what we have done. The behavior is really a power law for large beta. The exponent that we get for the power law is not matching. So the conjecture is that the one we derived is correct, but the one they got is a bit worse. Okay, but this is very difficult proof already. And one thing I wanted to say, yeah, of course, at very small beta, okay, I mentioned it orally, but I should say, so in dimension 1, you always have exponential decay at every temperature, but in any dimension, you have exponential decay at sufficiently high temperature. So this is the restriction to large beta is again completely natural because it's wrong in okay, this I could say, but okay, this I could say, I don't know. Okay, I will write it in the next board. Okay, let me write it here. So, in any dimension, exponential decay at small beta. Okay, that's always true. So here we cannot hope for a better result. But if you combine this observation with this observation, you see that in the XY model in dimension 2, even though there is no phase transition in the sense of what we saw in the Ising model with a positive spontaneous magnetization, there is still a phase transition of a much more subtle kind in the behavior of the two-point function. So at high temperature, the two-point function decays exponentially fast, while at low temperature, the two-point function decays only as a power law. So there is really a completely different behavior, and it's the so-called Kosterlitz-Thouless phase transition. So if you combine both, 2dxy undergoes Kosterlitz-Thouless phase transition. They recently got the Nobel Prize for these works, these physicists. Okay, so that's about what happens in the two-dimensional XY model. So I took it apart separately because it's expected that the result is not true for ON models with n larger than 2. So it is conjectured. It's one of the major open problems in statistical mechanics to prove this. So it is conjectured that ON models say in 2 dimension, so with n greater or equal to 3 in dimension 2, have, okay, let me just write it like that, 0 sk smaller than e minus c of beta times k for any beta. Okay, it's expected that the decay is always exponential if you take larger values of n. So there is no Kosterlitz-Thouless transition in the Heisenberg model, for example, or any of the model ON model with n larger than 2. And apparently, what distinguishes the case of spin taking value in the circle from the case of spin value taking value in a higher dimensional sphere is the fact that the group of rotation in dimension 2, so the rotation of the circle, is abelian, while the group of rotation in higher dimension is not abelian. Okay, so apparently that's the reason why the behavior should be different, because it's just a conjecture. Okay, with this I conclude this chapter, and we can make the break, except if there is a question about these general comments that I've made. No? Okay, we make 15 minutes break. Okay, I think we'll resume. So I would like to start with the last chapter we are going to discuss. This is chapter 10. It's about what is called reflection positivity. Which is a rather powerful technology. It has many applications. 2 main applications are described in the book in chapter 10. Due to lack of time, I will only discuss one of the 2, the most important one, and the one that you will need in Hugo's lectures in the second semester, the continuation of this lecture. Okay. so which is called the infrared bound. But let me first start with the reflection positivity in general. So in contrast to what we have done up to now, we are not going to work on ZD, taking subsets, growing subsets of ZD. It will be much more convenient, for reasons that will be clear in a moment, to work on growing torus. I will take a torus and I will let my torus grow and grow and grow. And this will be much more convenient for us. Of course, in the limit, since we are only interested in the limit of the expected value of local functions, it doesn't matter. You still get exactly the same type of infinite volume states, but still. So let me introduce a notation for my torus. I will denote it TL. This will be, say, Z over LZ to power D. I will not write explicitly the dimension in this notation. It will always be clear from the context. Okay? So this is the d-dimensional torus of size L. Okay. And I will always assume the size L to be even. This also will be clear in a second. Why? So L will always be assumed to be even. So I will not state it each time. It will always, in the whole chapter, L is assumed to be even. Okay. So as the title suggests, this has to do with reflections. So let me introduce these reflections, what I mean by them, a bit informal way. Very simple thing that I want to discuss. Let's take, I'm drawing the one-dimensional torus because it's easier. Okay, so that's the one-dimensional torus of size 8. That's T8. Okay. And now I'm going to consider reflection through planes, reflection of the torus, reflection that leave the torus invariant through planes which go across edges. So I will take a plane like this one. So I have some plane. Of course, I'm drawing it for the one-dimensional torus, so just a line. In general, you have a plane cutting the torus into half, and it's going through edges here and there. Right? And then I can define the application that maps every vertex on one side of the plane to the corresponding vertex on the other side of the plane, interchange the two. So this reflection, I will call it theta. So I have a reflection like that I will call theta. Hope it's clear. This line that I've chosen, so once I've chosen this axis here, in the reflection plane, it cuts the torus into two parts that I will call T8 plus, it's this half, composed of these edges, these vertices, and then I have T8 minus on the other side, okay, which is composed of these vertices. So T8 plus is mapped onto T8 minus and vice versa by the application theta. Okay, so that let me try to make a kind of picture in dimension, one dimension higher. So we have a torus, of course. We have our grid on the torus, okay, somewhere, and then we have a plane, a fix on plane. And then this plane is intersecting the torus here and there. Okay. And then this cuts the torus into two pieces, which will be T L plus and TL minus. Okay, this half of the torus and this half L minus, and then we have a reflection through this plane that I call theta. I hope it's clear what I mean by reflection. Okay. Okay. So now, to each vertex of our torus, here or there, I will associate some single spin space. So the values that the spins can take, I will call it omega 0. This will be the single spin space. So it's really for the Ising model, it would be plus or minus the two-element set, which is plus or minus 1. And for the XY model, it would be a circle, and so on and so forth. So for the moment, I'm not assuming any particular structure on this single spin space. But later on in the chapter, I will assume more and more structure. Okay? But at the moment, it doesn't matter. And then I can define the configurations, omega L, which will just be omega 0 to the torus. Okay, all functions from the torus of size L to this single spin space. So this will be configuration of my model. And configuration will, as usual, be denoted by small omega. Now, this application theta, which is really defined on the torus it's associated, it's mapping vertices to vertices, I can extend it in a natural way to configurations, functions, and measures. And this I want to briefly introduce. So theta can be extended as follows. So I will define theta acting on configuration omega as follows. So the configuration I get at vertex I will just be omega of theta I. Okay. And then same thing for function. If I want theta of a function f evaluated at the configuration omega, this will be just f of theta of omega. So these are definitions. Okay. And then for measures, the same. So if I want, say, the expected value of f under some measure theta of mu, where mu is a measure on the set of configurations, this is defined as the expected value of theta f with respect to mu. Okay, so the natural extension of theta to configuration functions and measures. Okay. This is what I wanted to say about the reflections. There is one thing I should introduce. Let us denote by A plus. Maybe I think I just write A plus. Yes. So A plus of theta. So I'm given some reflection theta. Then I define A plus of theta as the set of all functions, all local functions, say from omega L to R, such that the support of the function f is a subset of the plus part of the t plus TL plus. Okay. Okay, so these are functions that would be a function which is in A plus theta. It's a function whose support is in the positive part of the torus with respect to this particular reflection theta. And the function living here would be in the algebra A minus, so A minus theta will be the set of all functions, okay, same thing, which have a support included in T L minus. Okay. So these are two algebras of functions. And one can see this reflection theta as inducing an isomorphism between these two algebras. So theta can be seen as an isomorphism between these two algebras. And I will state it in a more precise way as an exercise, an elementary exercise. So check that for any function fg which are defined in A plus of theta, and for any real number lambda, the following is true. So I have that theta. Okay, first theta square of f is f. Okay, that's pretty obvious. Theta of lambda f is lambda theta of f. Theta of f plus g is theta of f plus theta of g. theta of fg is theta of f, theta of g. And the last thing I will need is theta of e to the f is e to the theta f. Okay. So all follow essentially immediately from the definition. Okay. So it's very simple. But so these are manipulations that I will use. All these properties, I will use them in my computation all the time, so I wanted to state them explicitly. Okay. Okay, so these are what I mean by reflections. So why the torus? It's convenient to work with a torus rather than a subset of ZD, a finite subset of ZD, because there are many reflections that I can take on a torus. While for a finite subset of ZD, usually you have at most two. It's not as convenient. It will be very important for us that we have many reflections to play with. So I've still not defined what I mean by reflection positivity. So this comes now. Definition 10.5. So let's fix the reflection theta as I defined before. So I'm only discussing reflection through edges. Everything I'm saying also works for reflection through vertices, but I will not need them for the application I have in mind. So to keep things a bit shorter, I will only discuss the reflection through edges. So let's theta be such a reflection. Then a measure mu, saying a measure on the set omega L with the product sigma algebra, so just a measure, is reflection positive. If we have the following two properties. So the first one is saying that the expected value of f theta g with respect to this measure mu, okay, so the integral of f omega theta g of omega mu d omega, this is the same thing as theta f g. Mu, and this is true for any f and g, saying a plus of theta. And then the second property, and that's the positivity, that's where positive comes from, is that if I take f equal to g, this is always non-negative for all f in a plus of theta. And let me denote also the set of all reflection positive measures. So I will denote by m reflection positive. I have to say with respect to which reflection. So I put the theta here. This will be the set of all mu, okay, measure on omega L such that mu is reflection positive. Positive with respect to theta. Okay. Good. So there is a very easy exercise now. Can do. Which is to show that the first of these two conditions is very weak. So it's basically, in all reasonable cases, it will be true without anything to check. So exercise is, I don't know if there is a number, but okay, exercise, check that 1 is equivalent to the statement that the measure mu is invariant under the reflection. So check it, it's easy. So this will be, okay, our measure mu will be we obviously have this kind of symmetry under reflection. This is the easy part. So the part which is non-trivial is really this positivity part which is in the second statement. And there we will have things to check to make sure that the measure we're interested in is reflection positive. Okay, so now the main observation, so why is it useful to have these two properties? Well, one way to see that is if I take a couple of function fg in a plus of theta, then I can map them on this expectation, theta g mu, this application that takes a couple of function in a plus and of theta and sends this expected value. This defines semi-positive. Okay, I think in English it's positive semi-definite. Maybe I'm putting the adjective at the wrong place. Positive semi-definite bilinear form. Sorry, bilinear form. And why is it nice? Well, as soon as you have a positive semi-definite bilinear form, it's almost a scalar product that I'm defining here. It's not quite a scalar product because it's possible that f theta f is equal to 0 without f being 0. Okay. So that's a bit annoying, but basically it's scalar products, and therefore you will be able to deduce a Cauchy-Schwarz inequality, which I'm going to do now. It's the usual proof of the Cauchy-Schwarz inequality. And this Cauchy-Schwarz inequality, it's what is at the heart of this reflection positivity technique. Okay. Very simple observation that in this way you can define this Cauchy-Schwarz inequality. So let me briefly prove it, even though it's completely standard proof. But since it's so important here. So it's lemma 10.6. So take a measure mu which is reflection positive with respect to some reflection theta. Then we have the following. So for any fg in a plus of theta, we have f theta g square. This is always smaller or equal f theta f mu g theta g. So let's prove this. So the usual argument. So we just look at the expected value of, say, lambda f plus g. So fixed lambda is a real number, and you look at lambda f plus g, theta lambda f plus g, mu. Okay. Then, since I'm assuming mu to be reflection positive, I must have that for any function, say h theta h has to be 0, has to be greater or equal to 0. So for this particular function h, this must be true. So this is non-negative. Okay. But on the other hand, you can expand the square, and what you get is that this is lambda square f theta f mu plus 2 lambda f theta g mu plus g theta g. Right. So now we have a second degree polynomial in lambda, which is always non-negative, which means it has either 0 or one root, which means that its discriminant is smaller or equal to 0. If you write the discriminant, you get that it's given by, okay, you can divide by 2. So f theta g square minus f theta f, there is mu g theta g. This has to be large, smaller or equal 0, and this is exactly the statement which is here. Okay. So nothing special here, it's really just the usual Cauchy-Schwarz. Okay, so up to now, all this, there is no statistical mechanics in anything I've said. There is even no Gibbs measures at the moment. So I have to start particularizing a bit. In particular, is it easy to construct reflection positive measures? Because if we are discussing properties of some object that are basically impossible to construct, it's not very useful. So let's see how we can construct reflection positive measures. And what we are really interested in is reflection positive Gibbs measures. So it's 1032. Examples of reflection positive measures. Okay, so to do that on this single spin space that I've been using, the space that the set that you associate to each vertex, the possible values that each spin can take, if you want, I have to put a measure. So I will call it rho. So rho. So let rho be a measure. Measure on a single spin space with the sigma algebra that you want to put there. Okay. Discrete sigma algebra if you have discrete spins, whatever, right? Okay, it's just Borel sigma algebra in general. Okay. So this I will call this measure rho, which is defined on each single spin space. This is what I will call the reference measure. Reference measure. Okay. And then, like, from this reference measure, which is defined in each single spin space, I can construct a measure which is defined on the whole configuration space omega L as follows. So I just set what I will call mu 0, which is just the product measure. So for each vertex of the lattice, of the torus, I put a copy of the measure rho. Okay, it's just product of measure rho at each vertex of the torus. So this is a product measure by construction, and it turns out that it's trivial that product measures are reflection positive. So it's not yet a very interesting measure, right? It's product measure. If you want, you are describing a statistical mechanics system at infinite temperature. So it's not really what we want to do. But let's start with that. So mu 0 is necessarily reflection positive with respect to any reflection theta. With respect to any reflection theta. Okay, well, you have to write f theta g, mu naught. Now, by assumption, so f and g are both in A+, which means that f is in A+ of theta, A+ of theta, and theta g is in A- of theta. G was in A+, but theta g is pushed on the other side, so this is in A- of theta. Okay. So in particular, the support of the function f and the support of the function theta g are disjoint. Okay. So this implies that the support of f intersection the support of theta g, it's empty. But this is a product measure. So if I take the expected value with respect to a product measure of the product of two functions which have disjoint support, then this factorizes. So that's just f mu 0 theta g of mu 0. But then the only observation that is left to make is that this is obviously equal to g of mu 0. Why? Because, okay, Let me do it in two stages. So this is by definition theta of mu 0, I'm just reflecting the measure, but this is equal to g mu 0 because going from mu 0 to theta of mu 0 is just changing the labels of all my vertices. I'm renaming my vertices, but the measure is a product measure. It doesn't care how you label the vertices. There is no geometry there, it's just a product measure. Okay? So you can just relabel things, and then obviously you will get that this is equal to that. So that means that your expected value of f theta g is just the expected value of f times the expected value of g. And then it's obvious that the condition that define the reflection positive measures, these two conditions, are satisfied. Okay, the first one because it's completely symmetric in f and g, what we get. And the second one, if you take f is equal to g, you get that f theta f is the expected value of f square, so which is also non-negative. So it's trivial. Okay, so for product measures, there is no problem. So, but we are not interested in product measures. We're interested in Gibbs measures, which are of the form of product measures with a density which is of the form E minus H for some Hamiltonian. Okay, so that's what we want to do. What condition can we put on the Hamiltonian in such a way that if I have a product measure as my reference measure, if you want, and I multiply it by E minus H, I keep the reflection positivity property. So that's what we are going to investigate now. I'm going to prove some sufficient condition. Here. Okay. This I've done. Okay, so from now on, as I said, I will slowly add additional properties, additional structure in our setting. So from now on, we are going to assume it's not actually very important, but it's technically very useful, and for us, for the example I have in mind, what I want to do with these techniques, this will always be true. So we assume that the reference measure rho, so the measure that is associated to each single spin space, that the reference measure rho is compactly supported. Compactly supported. And as a finite measure. All this is just to make sure that when I write a partition function later, it will exist. Okay, that's the only thing. You can make much weaker assumptions, but this is enough. Okay. So now the Gibbs distribution. Okay, so it's a probability measure on omega L and the product of the F0. Okay. Associated to a particular Hamiltonian, to a Hamiltonian HL, okay, which is just a function from omega L to R. The same setting as usual at the moment, is defined as probability that it gives to some particular event, this sigma algebra, is the integral over all configurations E minus HL of omega over the partition function. Then we want the configuration to satisfy the event A, and then we have the measure mu 0, which is just the product of all these rho. Okay. Okay, as I said, so let me maybe write it once more. So this mu 0, it's really the product, it's defined to be equal to the product of the rho, right? Same as before. Product over I in the torus. Okay. Okay. And the partition function is what you need to have a probability measure. So Zn is the integral over omega L, E minus HL omega mu 0 d omega. So that's exactly the usual definition. Okay. So now I want to put condition on this function h, this Hamiltonian, which makes sure that the measure mu L is reflection positive. Okay, we already know that this guy is reflection positive. We want to prove that this guy is reflection positive. So it's lemma 10.8. Tells you the following. So let's take mu L as above. Theta a reflection. Okay. Assume that minus the Hamiltonian, it's convenient because it's minus the Hamiltonian which appears here. So let's assume that minus the Hamiltonian takes the form of some function A plus its reflection plus a sum, an arbitrary sum of function of the form C alpha, theta C alpha. Okay, where for some functions A and C alpha, some indices, index set, okay, in A plus of theta. That's the structure I want, so a function, its reflection, and then a sum of terms which involve a function on T plus and its reflection on T minus. Okay. And then the measure mu L is reflection positive with respect to theta. Okay. So you need some reflection, some kind of reflection invariance of the Hamiltonian to make sure that you get a reflection positive. Measure okay, proof. What we have to analyze is the product f theta g for two functions f and g, which are in A plus of theta. Then this, by definition, it's 1 over z. Okay. Then you get, this I could have maybe said here. Is it worthwhile saying it in general? Okay, I will say it here. So, okay, no, let me say it. Let me say it here. At the level of the partition function, for example, it's easier to write. So this I can, of course, write. You see that it's the integral over omega L against the measure mu 0. So I can see this as the expected value of E minus H L mu 0. Right? And I can do the same thing here. I'm integrating this guy against mu 0. So I can write it always as an expected value of all this mess against with respect to the measure mu 0. That's what I want to do here. So I take out 1 over z, and then I'm left with the integral of this time E minus H against mu 0. So this will be f theta g E minus HL, which I will write explicitly if I have enough space. Okay, let me, okay, I will do it in 2 steps, otherwise I will not have enough space. Against mu 0. And let me write it here again explicitly. So it's 1 over ZL f theta g. This is minus HL, by assumption it has this form. So it's A plus theta of A plus sum over alpha C alpha theta of C alpha. Okay. And then expected value with respect to the product measure mu 0. Okay? And then the idea, which is pretty elementary, is to expand. Okay, let me write this as a product of exponentials so that I can explain it here. So you expand this exponential in Taylor series. So I'm expanding this, that's just the sum over all n greater or equal to 0, 1 over n factorial, sum over alpha 1, alpha n, product I equal 1 to n of C alpha I, theta of C alpha I. Right? Just expanding the exponential. And this will give me, so still the 1 over the L, I don't care about. Then I get sum over n greater or equal 0, 1 over n factorial. I have this sum over alpha 1, alpha n. And then I get the expected value of f, theta g, Ea, E theta a. And then I get the product over all I from 1 to n of C alpha I, theta C alpha I. Okay, mu 0. Just using linearity, I can write it this way. And now I want to use the fact that I already know that mu 0, which is just a product measure, mu 0 is reflection positive. So I want to use that to say things about what happens inside here. So to do that, I need to write what is inside this expectation in a form which is suitable to discuss the properties of reflection positivity. That is, this I can write, all this mess here, which is inside the expectation, I can write it as, so f e to the a, product I equal 1 to n C alpha I, okay? And then theta of g e to the a, this one, and then product I equal 1 to n of C alpha I. Okay? I'm just putting everything that has been, on which theta has been acting on one side, and I'm acting with theta on the product of all these things, and then the rest on the left-hand side. Okay, that's what you get. But now you can use the fact that mu 0 is reflection positive. So mu 0 belongs to MRP of theta. This implies that this expectation, which is here, expectation of, okay, it's F, Ea, product of C alpha I, theta, G, Ea, product of C alpha I. This expectation here, it's invariant if I move the theta on the other function. Okay, so it's equal to theta of f and all this mess times g and all this mess. Otherwise I won't have enough space. I'm just moving theta from acting on this function to acting on this function. Okay, that's just, I can because it's the first property of reflection positive measures, and mu 0 is reflection positive. So that's certainly true. But if I do that, so I've moved the theta here, now I can go upward again, and I will arrive at the expected value under mu L of theta f times g. So let me write it down. This is equal, well, this implies that f theta g mu L is equal to g, theta f g mu L, okay, just by going upward again. So that proves the first part, the first property that defines reflection positive measures. I still have to check the second one, but again, using the fact that mu is in MRP of theta, this also implies the fact that f e to the a product of C alpha I, theta, and now I take f equal to g, f e to the a product of C alpha I, mu 0. The function which is here is the same as the function which is here. So since mu 0 is reflection positive, this is non-negative. And then, if this is non-negative here, everything here is non-negative, so this is non-negative. Like that, f, theta f, mu L is non-negative. So we have both this and that, so mu L is indeed reflection positive. It's not very difficult. I have 5 minutes. Okay, let me try. We'll see if I have time. To do that, I want to give one particular explicit example of Hamiltonian which has this structure. Okay. It's a generalization of what we will need. So what we want to prove in this chapter is that ON models, and actually a generalization of that, but ON models have a spontaneous magnetization at low temperatures. So I want to be able to cover ON models. So what I will introduce now covers ON models. It covers more than that. I will at least state things. Maybe I will not start the proof, otherwise I will have to go too fast. But let me at least put the settings. So it's example 1010. So here I want to take omega 0, which is a single spin space. I want to take R2 nu for some integer nu. Strictly positive. I want to take rho some compactly supported measure on omega 0 as usual. Then I want to introduce a coupling constant that I will denote GKM. So these will be non-negative numbers for any m which is between 1 and nu, and for any k which is between 1 and the dimension, the lattice. And then I can define the Hamiltonian. So the Hamiltonian that we are going to consider is the following. So HL will be minus the sum over all neighbors in the torus. So I've never said that. So EL will be the edges in the torus. Okay, it's clear. Maybe I can write it. EL is the set of all IJ subset of the torus such that I and J are neighbors. Okay. So sum over all edges in the torus, sum over all M from 1 to nu, G, I, J, M, S, I, M, S, J, M. I'm almost done. And I just have to say what I mean by these different notations. So where this is the set of edges, and then we have written J, Ij, M, by definition is J, K, M, when I and J are two neighboring vertices which differ only in their M's component, or K's component. J differ. They are neighbors, so they differ only in one component. I'm assuming it's the K's component. So in a sense, you have coupling constant between spins that are different along in the different direction of the lattice. Okay, that's what I'm assuming here. And moreover, this is just the M's component of SI. So SI is really the vector SI1, SI nu. Okay. Spins take value in R nu. Okay. So SIM is the M's component of this vector. So what you get is really, so if you take all the Gij equal, so if all these guys are equal to beta, for example. Okay. Then you can take all this beta outside the sum, and what you get is sum over m from 1 to nu of SIM Sj which is just the scalar product of SIM Sj. Okay? But I want to show that you can, with no problem, introduce anisotropic, deformation of the scalar product, and this will still be fine. So what I will show next time is that this Hamiltonian, this type of Hamiltonian, is of the form that I've stated before. So the measure, the corresponding Gibbs measure is reflection positive. In particular, since the ON model corresponds to setting J equal to beta, we will get that the ON model is reflection positive. Okay. Are there questions? If not,